My name is Nief, and I research how citizens' rights were affected by government surveillance. I started my research by reading the survey done by the Pew Research Center about how certain groups are more accepting of limited speech than others. But almost immediately afterwards, I saw the work of Banksy and how certain other demographics completely reject government surveillance because they feel it as an infringement on their rights. And today in the news, with ISIS still pressing our government to make changes in order to protect the citizens, some of these rights still have to be changed, and so it's still a relevant topic. So that led me to the research question of to what extent American citizens' rights are the same under these certain surveillance acts. And through my research, I found that although historically the rights haven't necessarily changed from their roots drastically, through the eyes of some legal courts and ethical advocate groups, they have completely abandoned the ideas established in the Constitution for what these rights were truly meant to be. To begin, we have to really know about which rights we're talking about, and so the rights truly in conflict with surveillance acts are often the First and the Fourth Amendments. The first, of course, being the freedom of speech and press and assembly, whereas the fourth being the one of the government not being allowed to have random search and seizures without warrants, and that's the one that's often the most at conflict with surveillance acts. Certain groups like the Civil Liberties Union often use a strict interpretation of these rights and say that they've definitely been abandoned due to the fact that there's no absolute freedom anymore, and the fact that they completely abandon the fact that they can't come in and investigate you without any prior knowledge. Whereas other professors like Paul Sturgis, a professor of civil liberties, use more of a loose interpretation of the Constitution and say that there was never necessarily entirely absolute freedom and that there was always necessarily limitations on these freedom. And a document released by the UN supports this idea, stating that every successful democracy has had some sense of limited freedom in their acts. And so they see it more as a continuation of these limitations is actually what's containing the essence of the Constitution. And by continuing these limitations to make it a successful democracy, they're continuing the actual motive that was used to create the Constitution. However, plenty of courts and other legal systems see it in another light. Often when it's taken to court, the FBI stands alone on their certain surveillance groups. Despite the appraise that they received from their own former director, Robert Mueller III, who says that they've been able to achieve much more to protect the citizens due to the facts and the change made by the surveillance acts. Still, again, the Civil Liberty Union and other groups take them to court, often trying to repeal certain acts of these surveillance acts, such as Section 215 and 550, that make it much easier for the surveillance groups to go around any legal issues by attaining warrants without actually having to go through court and using their own courts to attain their own warrants. And repeatedly, these courts rule in favor of the people, and the verdict is often to try and limit the power of these surveillance groups. But once again, the largest issue that's often not seen by surveillance isn't necessarily seen in courts or in historical papers, and that's because it affects individuals on a certain level. And these consequences were not necessarily seen or had a physical representation until the works of Alexander O'Connor and Jahara Farhan, who were professors at Cal Berkeley, who found that these monitoring and those people who were monitored had a change in their psyche, and that there was increased tendencies of anxiety and anger and violent tendencies with all these people. So not only is the government using unethical tactics to get information from these people, but they're completely abandoning the role of the government established in the Constitution. The government was meant to protect the people and their liberties at whatever cost, but instead they're forcing these people to change who they really are by invading into their own personal space and their own freedoms. So obviously these have to be changed to avoid any legal and ethical conflicts in the future. One possible way to avoid this would be to pose a bill to the government that forces these surveillance groups to attain warrants through the court system, and by doing this, they would attain warrants, and their investigations would no longer be seen as unconstitutional due to the warrants being granted out by the court system. However, to pass a controversial bill like this through the Senate, House, and Congress, and through the President would be an issue, definitely because there's people on both sides that would argue for the justification of either passing it or removing it. And with a divide in the Senate currently of 54 Republicans and 44 Democrats, almost no group would ever get a two-thirds majority to pass it or even further overcome a presidential veto. Instead, a more plausible solution would be to increase minority and government cooperations so that less unethical choices are made in the future during surveillance. Back in 2006, the Muslim American Society was established with this exact mission to kind of combat the increased volume of surveillance put on Muslim American citizens following 9/11. Since then, they've established a directory and an advisory board to give these citizens more voice in the government on certain decisions. So, since there's been such a great success for this one group, I feel like we should raise federal funding for other groups to give more demographics their own voice. Obviously, there might be an issue with raising the funds to establish so many organizations. However, I feel like we should be able to draw from the budget of these surveillance groups again to establish some of the funds for these other minority groups. This would diminish the power of the surveillance groups even more and create a baseline for the funds of these other minority demographic groups. And so in the end, I found that the greatest way to combat the issue of government surveillance in rights isn't necessarily to remove the camera, but instead to change the person that's behind the camera.